At exactly 8:37 inches the morning, on October 5th, 2012, a 10-year-old girl vanished from a suburban street in Westminster, Colorado. She didn't scream, she didn't run. She simply disappeared between her front door and a friend's house, less than 3 blocks away. In the next 6 hours, while her mother slept upstairs, while teachers marked her absent, while the first snow of autumn covered her footprints, a little girl named Jessica Ridgeway was fighting for her life. And the person responsible? He was 17 years old, he lived in her neighborhood, and he'd been watching her for weeks. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments below, and if you find value in these stories, hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us bring these important cases to light. This is Easy Case. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of Colorado's most heartbreaking investigations. A case that began with a missing child and ended with a confession that shocked even the most seasoned detectives. But before we talk about what was taken, we need to understand who Jessica Ridgeway really was. Because she wasn't just a headline. She wasn't just a statistic in a database somewhere. She was a real little girl, with dreams that stretched far beyond her 10 years, and a heart that everyone who knew her said was simply too big for her small body. Jessica Christine Ridgeway was born on January 23, 2002, in Colorado, and from the moment she entered the world, her family noticed something different about her. They called it an old soul. You know that rare quality some children have where they seem to understand things they shouldn't, where they carry wisdom that doesn't match their age? That was Jessica. But here's what made her special. She had that maturity, that awareness, yet she embraced childhood with absolute joy. She didn't rush through being a kid, she savored it. By the time she turned 10, Jessica had developed a fierce sense of independence. Most kids that age are still asking their parents to wake them up, still needing reminders about homework and chores. Not Jessica. She went to her mother and specifically asked for her own alarm clock because she wanted to wake herself up for school. Think about that for a second. A 10-year-old voluntarily asking for more responsibility. That wasn't rebellion or attitude. That was Jessica practicing for the teenager and adult she couldn't wait to become. She was always looking ahead, always preparing, always growing into the person she wanted to be. Jessica lived in a single-story home on Moore Street in Westminster with her mother, her grandmother, and her aunt. It was a house full of women, full of what family members described as constant conversation, endless laughter, and that particular beautiful chaos that comes when multiple generations share the same roof. Her parents had separated years before. Her father, Jeremiah Bryant, lived all the way in Independence, Missouri, more than 600 miles away. Despite the distance, despite some ongoing legal complications about child support and custody, Jessica maintained relationships with both her parents. She understood, even at 10, that families come in different shapes, that love doesn't always look the way movies say it should. She attended Witt Elementary School, where she was in 5th grade. The school served about 330 students in the Jefferson County School District, and it sat roughly 1 mile from Jessica's front door. 1 mile. A distance she'd walked dozens, probably hundreds of times. Sometimes alone, sometimes with friends, always confident because she knew every turn, every crosswalk, every shortcut. Her teacher, Sheila Grace, knew Jessica as a bright, engaged student. The kind of kid who actually did the reading, who asked questions that showed she was thinking beyond the assignment. But what stood out even more than her intelligence was her kindness. Jessica was the type of child who noticed when someone looked sad. And she didn't just notice, she'd go out of her way to cheer them up. Her family called her their rock. Think about that designation for a moment. The youngest person in a household of women, and they called her their rock. That tells you everything about who Jessica was becoming. She had that quality, that rare emotional intelligence where she could sense what others were feeling and respond with genuine empathy. At 10 years old, Jessica was already developing the kind of emotional awareness that many adults never achieve. She was becoming the kind of person who makes the world better simply by existing in it. Her hobbies painted a perfect picture of an American preteen in the early 2010 seconds. She loved Nickelodeon shows, especially Victorious, Shake It Up, and Wizards of Waverly Place. Her favorite song, the one she played on repeat until her family probably wanted to hide her iPod, was Carly Rae Jepsen's Call Me Maybe. That detail, that simple fact about a pop song, would later bring both smiles and tears when it played at her memorial service. Because that's what grief does. It turns ordinary things into unbearable reminders. Jessica loved to dance. Not formal lessons necessarily, though she was involved in cheerleading. She loved the spontaneous dancing that kids do when music plays and nobody's watching. She'd make up her own choreography, invent her own songs, put on little performances for her family in the living room. She loved playing dress-up, caring for her pets, and looking after her neighbors' hairless cats. She was responsible, creative, joyful. And then there was purple. Purple was Jessica's absolute favorite color. Not pink, which is what people might assume for a 10-year-old girl. Purple. Deep, rich, royal purple. She had purple-framed glasses that she wore constantly because her eyesight wasn't good without them. She loved anything and everything purple. Clothes, school supplies, decorations in her room. This detail, this simple childhood preference for a particular color, would soon become something much bigger, a symbol of solidarity for an entire community. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Physically, Jessica stood 4 feet 10 inches tall and weighed approximately 80 pounds. She had shoulder-length blonde hair that caught the light just right, bright blue eyes that seemed to notice everything, and a distinctive gap between her front 2 teeth that gave her smile extra character. She had a small bruise on her nose, hidden beneath those purple glasses, the kind of minor childhood injury that happens during active play and heals in a week. Jessica was a member of the Stanley Lake Pee Wee Cheer Clinic, and cheerleading wasn't just an activity for her. It was a passion. It was a dream. She'd already announced her future plans to anyone who would listen. She was going to be a high school cheerleader, but not just any cheerleader. She wanted to be, and I'm quoting her exact words here, a cheerleader who will be kind to everyone. Pause on that for just a moment. A 10-year-old child, dreaming about her teenage years, already understood that kindness mattered more than popularity, more than athletic ability, more than being the best or the prettiest or the most talented. She was setting her own standards for the person she wanted to become, and those standards were built on empathy. Jessica's mother worked an overnight shift at a software company in Boulder. Her schedule ran from 10 at night until 7 in the morning. It was a difficult arrangement, the kind that requires sacrifice and careful planning, but it worked for their family's needs. The routine was this. Jessica's mother would return home just as Jessica was waking up. They'd spend the morning together, while Jessica prepared for school. Then her mother would sleep during the day while Jessica was in class, waking up around 4 in the afternoon, just in time to greet her daughter when she came home. This routine required something significant from Jessica: trust, responsibility. She had to get herself ready in the mornings. She had to walk to school without her mother accompanying her. For a 10-year-old, this was real independence. But Jessica had proven herself capable, time and time again. The system worked. Everyone trusted it. On Thursday, October 4th, 2012, everything was completely normal. Jessica went to school. She came home. She did her homework, probably complained about a math problem or two. She played with her pets. She watched some television. She talked with her family. It was an unremarkable Thursday, the kind of day that only becomes precious in retrospect, when you realize it was the last normal day you'll ever have. The last time everything made sense. That evening, Jessica went to bed at her usual time. She set her alarm clock for 7:45 the next morning. She laid out her clothes for school because she was organized like that, always thinking ahead. She was prepared, responsible, all the things parents hope their children will be. Neither Jessica nor her mother could have known that Friday, October 5th, 2012, would be anything but ordinary. Neither of them could have known that a 17-year-old boy had been driving around their neighborhood for weeks, watching, waiting, hunting for an opportunity. Neither of them could have imagined that the trust they'd built, the independence Jessica had earned, the routine that had worked perfectly for months, was about to be shattered in the most horrific way possible. Friday morning began exactly as planned. Jessica's alarm clock went off at 7:45. She woke up, reached over, turned off that familiar beeping sound, and began her morning routine. She came downstairs, still probably a little groggy, and turned on the television while eating a granola bar. Just a normal Friday morning. Cartoons, or maybe the news playing in the background. The house quiet except for those familiar sounds. Then she went back upstairs to get dressed. Her mother, who had just finished her overnight shift and arrived home around the time Jessica was waking up, helped her daughter with a few last-minute preparations. Together, they peeled an orange for Jessica to take to school. Think about that small moment. A mother and daughter standing in the kitchen, peeling an orange together. Such an ordinary act of care, such a simple moment of connection, the kind of moment that happens in millions of homes every single morning and means nothing until suddenly it means everything. Jessica filled her water bottle, the one that would later become crucial evidence in the investigation. She gathered her backpack, the pink and black one decorated with characters from Victorious, with a keychain bearing her name dangling from the zipper. She was ready. Outside, snow was falling, the first real snow of autumn, coming down in those big, wet flakes that make everything look magical. The kind of snow that kids get excited about because it means winter is coming, means holidays are approaching, means the world is transforming into something beautiful. Jessica bundled up in her black puffy jacket with pink lining. She pulled on black boots with pom-poms attached. She adjusted her purple-framed glasses on her nose, making sure they sat just right. She looked like any other kid heading to school on a snowy October morning. Before leaving, Jessica made a phone call. She called a male friend who lived a few blocks away, spoke with the boy's father, and asked if his son would be walking to school that morning. The father said yes and told Jessica his son would wait for her at their house. Jessica agreed to meet him there. This phone call, made around 8:25 inches the morning, would later be identified as one of the last known communications Jessica had with anyone. At approximately 8:30, Jessica said goodbye to her mother and walked out the front door. Her mother watched from the window as her daughter headed down the snowy sidewalk, her backpack bouncing slightly with each step, her boots leaving small prints in the fresh snow. I watched her walk out the door. Jessica's mother would later tell investigators and reporters, her voice breaking with emotion that no parent should ever have to feel. I shut the door, and that is the last time I saw her. Think about that moment from a mother's perspective. She had absolutely no reason to worry. Her daughter had walked this route dozens, probably hundreds of times. The neighborhood was safe. Witt Elementary was only a mile away. Jessica knew the route by heart. She was meeting a friend. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. Everything was exactly as it should be. Jessica's mother, exhausted from her overnight shift, went upstairs to sleep. She placed her cell phone in another room because she needed uninterrupted rest. A college she'd applied to kept calling, and she couldn't afford to be woken up. She climbed into bed, pulled up the covers, and fell asleep, trusting that her daughter was safe, that the world was predictable, that the routine they'd established would hold. Downstairs, the house was quiet and empty. Outside, Jessica was walking through falling snow, less than 1,000 feet from her front door. She would never make it to her friend's house. Let's establish the timeline carefully here, because every single minute matters in cases like this. Every second counts. Every moment is crucial. 2:30 inches the morning. Jessica leaves her home on Moore Street, walking toward her friend's house 3 blocks away. 8:40 inches the morning. The friend's father, having waited 10 minutes for Jessica to arrive and not wanting his own son to be late for school, makes a decision. He assumes Jessica made other arrangements or decided to walk directly to school instead. He drives his son to Witt Elementary. It's a reasonable assumption. Kids change their minds. Plans shift. No reason to worry. 8:50 inches the morning. The school bell rings. Classes begin. Students file into their classrooms, hang up their coats, pull out their homework. In Sheila Grace's 5th grade classroom, Jessica's seat is empty. 10:00 inches the morning. After completing morning attendance and administrative tasks, the school office secretary calls the cell phone number on file for Jessica's mother to inquire about Jessica's absence. Standard procedure. The phone rings in an empty room. Jessica's mother, sleeping upstairs, doesn't hear it. A voicemail is left. "Hi, this is Witt Elementary, calling about Jessica. She's marked absent today. Please call us back to confirm." For the next 6 hours, nobody realizes that Jessica Ridgeway is missing. Think about those 6 hours. Where was Jessica? Was she still alive? Was she calling for help? Was she trying to escape? Was she already gone? These are the questions that would later haunt everyone involved in this case. Questions that can never be fully answered because the person who knows the truth has never been completely forthcoming about every detail. Some answers die with victims. Some truths stay buried. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Jessica's mother wakes from sleep. She's groggy, still tired, but her internal clock tells her it's time to wake up and prepare for Jessica to come home from school. She reaches for her phone and sees the missed call notification. She listens to the voicemail. The school's message is straightforward, routine even. Jessica didn't come to school today. Is she sick? Please call us back to confirm her absence. Jessica's mother's confusion quickly turns to concern, then to something much darker. Fear. Real, primal fear. Jessica wasn't sick. Jessica had left for school that morning. Jessica's mother had watched her walk out the door. She'd seen her daughter disappear down the snowy sidewalk with her own eyes. Her mind races through possibilities, each one more desperate than the last. Maybe Jessica went to a friend's house after school. But no, the school is saying she never arrived at school at all. Maybe she's at the friend's house she was supposed to meet that morning. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding. Maybe the school made a mistake with attendance. Maybe. Jessica's mother drives to Chelsea Park, a small playground area along Jessica's route to school where kids sometimes met before walking together to Witt Elementary. No sign of Jessica. She drives to a friend's house. No answer. She drives to the school itself, arriving just before classes let out for the day. At the school, administrators confirm the terrible truth. Jessica never arrived that morning. She was marked absent at 8:50. No one had seen her all day, not in the hallways, not in the cafeteria, not anywhere. It's at this moment that Jessica's mother later described feeling that sensation every parent dreads. That pit in your stomach when you just know, that something is terribly wrong. You get a pit in your stomach you don't want any parent to experience in their entire life, she would later recount, her voice barely above a whisper. When you know your child has been taken. At 4:23 inches the afternoon, according to official dispatch records obtained by the Denver Post, Jessica's mother calls Westminster police to report her daughter missing. Nearly 8 hours have passed since Jessica walked out her front door. 8 hours. In cases of child abduction murder, 3/4 of the victims are dead within 3 hours of being taken. That's not speculation. That's not fear-mongering. That's statistical reality based on decades of FBI data. When a child is taken by a stranger, time doesn't just matter. Time is everything. And 8 hours had already slipped away. What time is it where you are right now? Think about how much can happen in 8 hours. Think about how far someone can drive, how much evidence can be destroyed, how cold a trail can become. Now imagine that 8 hours is the head start a predator has with your child. If you're feeling that pit in your stomach right now, that tightness in your chest, you're beginning to understand what Jessica's mother felt the moment she realized her daughter was gone. And the worst part? The absolute worst part? The nightmare was only just beginning, because somewhere in Westminster, Colorado, a 10-year-old girl who wanted to be a kind cheerleader, who loved the color purple, who had set her own alarm clock that morning because she was responsible and independent and growing up exactly the way she should, was in the hands of someone who had been watching her, waiting for her, hunting her, and in the next 48 hours, a community would come together in ways that would restore your faith in humanity, even as the investigation would reveal evil that would shake that faith to its core. So here's the question I want you to think about, and I want you to leave your answer in the comments below. How do we balance giving our children the independence they need to grow with the protection they need to stay safe? Because Jessica did everything right, her mother did everything right. They had a system that worked, they had trust that was earned, and it still wasn't enough. If this story is affecting you the way it's affecting me, please hit that subscribe button right now. These cases matter, these stories need to be told, and Jessica deserves to be remembered not just as a victim, but as the remarkable little girl she was. In the next part of this investigation, we'll see how Westminster police responded, how a community mobilized in ways that would make national news, and how the color purple became a symbol of hope in the face of unimaginable darkness. But that 8-hour window, that gap between when Jessica disappeared and when anyone realized she was gone, that's the window that changed everything. And understanding what happened in those 8 hours would become the key to solving one of Colorado's most devastating crimes. Within 90 minutes of that phone call to police, Jessica Ridgway's face would be on every television screen in Colorado. Within 12 hours, over 1,000 people who had never met her would be walking through freezing temperatures searching for any trace of her. And within 1 week, what started as a desperate search for a missing child would transform into something far darker. But none of that had happened yet. Right now, at 4:23 inches the afternoon on October 5th, 2012, all anyone knew was that a 10-year-old girl had vanished somewhere between her front door and a friend's house 3 blocks away. When a child goes missing, there's a protocol, a system, steps that law enforcement follows because time is the enemy and chaos is the default. Westminster police understood this better than most. They'd trained for it. They'd studied the statistics. They knew that the first few hours after a child disappears are absolutely critical. They knew that in stranger abduction cases, which are mercifully rare but devastatingly dangerous, the outcome is often determined in the first 3 hours, and they knew that 8 hours had already passed. Westminster police responded immediately to Jessica's mother's call. One officer was dispatched to the Ridgeway home on Moore Street, while another went directly to Witt Elementary School. Additional units began canvassing the neighborhood between Jessica's house and the school, knocking on doors, asking questions, looking for anyone who might have seen something, anything, that could explain where a 10-year-old girl had gone. The investigators quickly established several key facts, and each fact narrowed the possibilities while simultaneously expanding the horror of what might have happened. First, Jessica had last been seen leaving her home at 8:30 that morning. This gave them a specific starting point for the timeline, a fixed moment when everything was still normal. Second, Jessica had called a friend's house at 8:25 and said she was coming to meet the friend before walking to school together. She never arrived at the friend's house. That meant something happened in those 3 blocks, in broad daylight, during the morning rush hour when people were leaving for work, when other kids were walking to school, when the world was awake and moving. Third, Jessica's route would have taken her past Chelsea Park, then through a series of residential streets covering approximately 1 mile total. It was a route she knew well, a route she'd walked many times. There was nothing unfamiliar about it, nothing that should have confused her or caused her to get lost. Fourth, and this is where the investigation hit its first terrifying wall, no one had seen anything suspicious that morning. No strange vehicles, no unusual people, no sounds of distress, no screaming, no struggle. Jessica had simply vanished from a suburban street in broad daylight, and somehow, impossibly, no one had witnessed it. Think about that for a moment. How does a child disappear in the middle of a residential neighborhood during morning hours without a single person seeing or hearing anything? What does that tell you about the person who took her? It tells you they were careful. It tells you they were quick. It tells you this wasn't random or impulsive. This was planned. Investigators also needed to quickly rule out the most common scenarios in missing child cases, because statistics don't lie, and law enforcement can't afford to waste time chasing the wrong leads. In the majority of cases involving missing children, a family member is responsible, usually a parent involved in a custody dispute. It's an ugly truth, but it's a truth nonetheless. Jessica's father, Jeremiah Bryant, lived in Independence, Missouri, more than 600 miles away. When investigators contacted him, they learned something that immediately cleared him as a suspect. He had been at work that day, and more importantly, he had actually appeared in court that very morning for a child support hearing, the hearing that had been scheduled for October 5th regarding Jessica. His alibi wasn't just solid, it was documented, time-stamped, and verified by multiple witnesses, including court officials. Jeremiah was devastated by the news, absolutely shattered, but he clearly had nothing to do with Jessica's disappearance. Jessica's mother had been home sleeping after her night shift. Her timeline was verified through her work records, through the school's phone call, through everything. Both parents provided DNA samples without hesitation. Both fully cooperated with investigators, answering every question, providing every detail, opening their lives completely to scrutiny, because when your child is missing, privacy doesn't matter, dignity doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is finding your child. By early evening, both parents were officially ruled out as suspects, which left the possibility that haunts every parent, the scenario that makes you hold your children a little tighter, the reason you tell them never to talk to strangers, never to get in a car with someone they don't know, never to go anywhere alone. Stranger abduction. Stranger abductions are statistically rare. Out of the hundreds of thousands of missing children reported each year in the United States, only about 100 are stereotypical kidnappings by strangers. But when they do happen, the outcome is often tragic. When a child is taken by someone they don't know, someone who has no connection to the family, someone who has been watching and waiting for an opportunity, the statistics become brutal. 3/4 of those children are dead within 3 hours. And 8 hours had already passed since Jessica walked out her front door. At approximately 9:15 that night, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation issued an Amber Alert for Jessica Ridgeway. If you've ever received one of those alerts on your phone, that jarring sound that cuts through whatever you're doing, that urgent message that makes your heart skip a beat, you know how serious they are. Amber Alerts aren't issued lightly. There are specific criteria that must be met. 1. Law enforcement must confirm that an abduction has taken place, not a runaway, not a misunderstanding, an actual abduction. 2. The child must be at risk of serious bodily injury or death. 3. There must be enough descriptive information about the child, abductor, or vehicle to believe the alert will help. 4. The child must be 17 years old or younger. Westminster Police spokesman Trevor Matarasso later explained to reporters why the alert wasn't issued immediately when Jessica's mother first called at 4:23. "We needed to develop reasonable suspicion that an abduction had occurred," he said. "We don't issue Amber Alerts for children who might have wandered off or run away. We need to be certain." By 9:15 that evening, given Jessica's age, her character, her established routine, the length of time that had elapsed, and the complete lack of any other explanation, they had developed that reasonable suspicion. They were certain. The alert was broadcast statewide across Colorado. It contained Jessica's description: white female, 10 years old, 4 feet 10 inches tall, approximately 80 pounds, blonde shoulder-length hair, blue eyes, wearing purple glasses, black jacket with pink lining, jeans, and carrying a purple backpack with her name on it. The alert asked anyone with information to call Westminster Police immediately. Within minutes, the tips began pouring in. Dozens at first, then hundreds. People calling to report suspicious vehicles they'd seen that morning. Neighbors remembering someone who didn't quite belong. Drivers who thought they'd seen a girl matching Jessica's description. Each tip had to be investigated. Each lead had to be followed. Because buried somewhere in that flood of information might be the one detail that would bring Jessica home. That first night, Friday, October 5th, stretching into Saturday, October 6th, was absolutely critical. Temperatures were dropping into the 30s. Snow was still falling intermittently. A 10-year-old child was somewhere out in those conditions. If she was still alive, if she was still fighting, if there was still time, Westminster Police established a command post at the Westview Recreation Center at 108th Avenue and Oak Street. Additional agencies were brought in because this was too big, too urgent, too important for one department to handle alone. Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, Arvada Police, the FBI's Denver Field Office, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. At least 50 officers worked through the night, coordinating search efforts, following up on tips, analyzing evidence, doing everything humanly possible to find Jessica. Bloodhounds were brought in to try to pick up Jessica's scent. The dogs were given items from Jessica's room, clothing she'd worn, bedding she'd slept in, anything that might help them track her. The dogs searched Chelsea Park, the route to school, the school itself, and expanding perimeters around all those locations. They worked through the night, their handlers watching for any sign that the dogs had caught something, any indication of which direction Jessica might have gone. Westminster firefighters deployed thermal imaging equipment, cameras that detect body heat and can locate living people even in darkness or hidden locations. They walked through parks, fields, and open spaces, hoping against hope to detect any sign of Jessica, any heat signature that might indicate a child hiding or trapped or waiting to be found. A police helicopter with night vision capabilities was requested, but the weather proved too severe. At those temperatures, ice would form on the rotor blades, making flight not just dangerous but potentially deadly. The aerial search would have to wait until daylight, so they searched on foot, in the dark, in the cold, in the snow, 50 officers and growing, all of them knowing the statistics, all of them understanding what those statistics meant, all of them refusing to give up, because giving up meant accepting that Jessica was already gone. What's the weather like where you are right now? Is it warm, cold, comfortable? Now imagine being 10 years old, wearing just a jacket and jeans, somewhere out in freezing temperatures. Imagine being scared. Imagine being alone. Imagine calling for help and no one hearing you. That's what drove those searchers through that first night. The image of Jessica somewhere out there, cold and terrified, waiting for someone to find her. By Saturday morning, October 6th, word had spread throughout the community. Local news was covering the story extensively. Every channel, every station. Jessica's face was everywhere. Social media posts about her were being shared thousands of times. Facebook, Twitter, every platform available. And people began showing up at the Westview Recreation Center asking how they could help. What happened next demonstrates something remarkable about human nature, something that restores your faith even in the darkest circumstances. When faced with unimaginable tragedy, when confronted with a child in danger, communities often respond with overwhelming compassion and unity. By Saturday afternoon, approximately 150 volunteers had joined the search. By Sunday, that number had grown to over 800. Eventually, more than 1,000 volunteers would participate in organized search efforts. Let me say that again. 1,000 volunteers. These weren't just people who knew Jessica or her family. Most of these volunteers had never met the Ridgeways. They were simply people who heard that a little girl was missing and felt compelled to do something. Parents who thought about their own children, grandparents who thought about their grandchildren, teachers who thought about their students, human beings who understood that a 10-year-old child was out there somewhere, and every minute counted. The volunteers called themselves Jessica's People. They worked out of a makeshift staging area in the parking lot of an American furniture warehouse store. They were organized into search teams, given specific areas to canvass, and sent out in groups. They walked through fields and forest areas. They knocked on doors, asking residents if they'd seen anything, if they'd checked their garages and sheds, and any place a child might be hidden or hiding. They posted flyers on every available surface, utility poles, store windows, community bulletin boards. Jessica's face was everywhere. And then something beautiful started happening. Purple ribbons began appearing. Purple, Jessica's favorite color. People tied purple ribbons around trees, around mailboxes, around fence posts. They wore purple clothing. They hung purple banners. The color became a visible representation of hope, solidarity, and the collective will of a community refusing to give up. A Facebook page was created by Kimberly Bowman, a woman who had never met Jessica but felt compelled to do something, anything, to help. The page became a central hub for organizing volunteers, sharing information, and providing updates. Within days, it had thousands of followers, people from across Colorado and beyond, all united by the simple desire to bring Jessica home. But here's what nobody was saying out loud. Here's the truth that everyone understood but refused to acknowledge. With each passing hour, the likelihood of finding Jessica alive was dropping. The statistics were clear. The timeline was brutal. And while hope is a powerful thing, hope doesn't change reality. By Sunday, October 7th, 48 hours after Jessica disappeared, the search had expanded to cover miles of terrain. Volunteers were no longer just searching the route to school, they were searching everywhere. Parks, open fields, construction sites, anywhere a body might be hidden. Notice that shift? From searching for a missing girl to searching for a body. Nobody said it explicitly, but everyone felt it. The search was changing, the hope was fading, the reality was setting in. Jessica's family held a press conference, pleading for information. Jessica's mother stood in front of cameras, her face showing the kind of exhaustion and anguish that no parent should ever have to display publicly. "Please," she said, her voice breaking, "if you have her, please let her go. Please bring her home. She's just a little girl. She just wants to come home." Think about having to do that. Think about standing in front of the world, begging a stranger to return your child. Think about the desperation, the helplessness, the knowledge that your words might be the only thing standing between your daughter and death. Investigators were following hundreds of tips. Each one had to be checked. Each one had to be investigated. Most led nowhere. A suspicious vehicle turned out to be a delivery truck. A strange person in the neighborhood turned out to be a new resident. A reported sighting turned out to be a different child entirely. Dead end after dead end after dead end. But investigators were also doing something else, something the public didn't see. They were analyzing patterns, looking at similar cases, building a profile of the type of person who would abduct a child in broad daylight from a residential neighborhood. This person was organized. The lack of witnesses suggested planning. The timing suggested surveillance. This wasn't someone who saw an opportunity and acted impulsively. This was someone who had been watching, waiting, choosing. This person likely lived in or near the area. Stranger abductions that occur in residential neighborhoods are often committed by someone familiar with the area, someone who knows the routines, the patterns, the vulnerabilities. This person was comfortable operating in daylight. That suggested confidence, experience, or both. And this person, based on the complete lack of evidence at the scene, knew how to avoid leaving traces. No witnesses, no physical evidence, no signs of struggle. That level of control is terrifying because it suggests this might not be the first time. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was consulted. They reviewed the case details and provided a preliminary profile. White male, likely between late teens and early 30s, familiar with the area, possibly living with family or alone, socially awkward or isolated. History of concerning behavior that others might have noticed but dismissed. But a profile doesn't find a missing child. Evidence does. Witnesses do. And so far, they had neither. By Monday, October 8th, 3 days after Jessica disappeared, the community was holding vigils. Hundreds of people gathered at Chelsea Park, holding candles, wearing purple, praying for a miracle. The local news covered it extensively. National news was starting to pick up the story. Jessica's case was becoming one of those rare missing child cases that captures national attention. But attention doesn't bring children home, and with each passing day, the unspoken truth became harder to ignore. On Tuesday, October 9th, something changed. A resident in Superior, Colorado, a town about 10 miles from Westminster, called police to report finding a suspicious item in a field near their home. The item was a backpack, pink and black, decorated with characters from Victorious, with a keychain bearing a name dangling from the zipper. Jessica's backpack. The backpack was found in an open space area near Rock Creek, lying in tall grass as if it had been tossed there. Investigators immediately secured the scene and began processing it for evidence. The backpack was carefully collected, photographed, and sent to the lab for analysis. Inside the backpack, they found Jessica's belongings, school supplies, papers, personal items, and a water bottle. That water bottle would become one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the entire investigation because water bottles hold something valuable: DNA, from saliva, from touch, from the person who last handled it. But here's what wasn't in that backpack: Jessica. There was no indication of where she was. No note, no clue, just her belongings, discarded in a field 10 miles from where she disappeared. The discovery of the backpack confirmed what investigators had feared. This wasn't a case of a child who wandered off and got lost. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a runaway situation. This was an abduction, and the person who took Jessica had driven her at least 10 miles away from her neighborhood before disposing of evidence. The search intensified. If the backpack was in Superior, maybe Jessica was too. Search teams flooded the area around Rock Creek. Volunteers combed through every inch of open space. Bloodhounds were brought back in, given the backpack to scent, hoping they could track where it had come from or where Jessica might be. But days passed with no additional discoveries. The backpack had given them evidence but not answers. It had confirmed their worst fears but not provided the breakthrough they desperately needed. On Wednesday, October 10th, 5 days after Jessica disappeared, another discovery was made. This one would end all hope and transform the investigation from a search for a missing child into a hunt for a killer. A woman walking in Patridge Park open space in Arvada, about 7 miles from Westminster, discovered human remains in a field. Partial remains. I'm not going to describe the details because Jessica deserves dignity even in death. But what was found was enough to know that a child had been murdered, and the manner in which the remains were found suggested something beyond murder. It suggested desecration. It suggested a level of depravity that even seasoned investigators found difficult to process. The remains were immediately secured. The area was locked down. Forensic teams worked through the day and into the night, carefully documenting everything, collecting every piece of evidence, treating the scene with the reverence it deserved. DNA analysis would take time, but investigators already knew the size, the age, the location, the timing. They knew these were Jessica's remains. They knew the search was over. They knew a 10-year-old girl who wanted to be a kind cheerleader, who loved the color purple, who had set her own alarm clock because she was responsible and independent, was dead. On Friday, October 12th, 1 week after Jessica disappeared, the coroner's office officially confirmed through DNA analysis that the remains found in Patridge Park were those of Jessica Christine Ridgeway. The news hit the community like a physical blow. The vigils that had been about hope became about mourning. The purple ribbons that had symbolized solidarity now symbolized grief. The volunteers who had searched for days, hoping to find Jessica alive, now had to accept that their worst fears had come true. Jessica's mother released a statement through police. "Our hearts are broken," it read. "We want to thank everyone who searched for Jessica, everyone who prayed for her, everyone who hoped with us. Jessica was a beautiful, kind, loving little girl, and we will miss her every day for the rest of our lives." At Witt Elementary School, counselors were brought in to help students process the loss. Jessica's classmates, children who had sat next to her just days before, now had to understand that she was never coming back. Her teacher, Shelia Grace, spoke to reporters through tears. "Jessica was special," she said. "She made everyone around her better. She made the world better. And now she's gone." A memorial service was held at the Coors Event Center at the University of Colorado. Thousands attended. They wore purple. They brought purple flowers. They played "Call Me Maybe," Jessica's favorite song, and people smiled through their tears, remembering a little girl who had loved to dance. But while the community mourned, investigators were working, because finding Jessica's body wasn't the end of the investigation. It was the beginning of a different kind of search. A search for justice. A search for the person who had taken Jessica, murdered her, and discarded her remains like she was nothing. The backpack, the water bottle, the remains, all of it was being processed for DNA evidence, touch DNA, trace evidence, anything that might identify the killer. And investigators were also doing something else. They were looking at the location where the remains were found and working backward. Patridge Park open space in Arvada, Rock Creek in Superior where the backpack was found, Moore Street in Westminster where Jessica was taken. When you map those locations, they form a pattern, a geographic profile. And that profile suggested the killer lived or operated in a specific area. Investigators began focusing on that area, looking at residents, checking backgrounds, following up on tips that had seemed irrelevant before but now took on new significance. And then, on October 19th, 2 weeks after Jessica disappeared, something happened that would crack the case wide open. Something so unexpected, so brazen, so disturbing, that it would confirm investigators' worst suspicions about the person they were hunting. Someone attempted another abduction. A woman was jogging in Kettner Lake open space in Littleton, just a few miles from where Jessica's remains had been found. A person approached her, attempted to grab her, tried to force her into a vehicle, but this victim wasn't a 10-year-old child. This was an adult woman who fought back, who screamed, who escaped. And in the struggle, she got a good look at her attacker. She also noticed something else, something crucial. The attacker had left something behind in the struggle, a piece of evidence that would tie this attempted abduction directly to Jessica's murder. The killer had made a mistake, and that mistake would lead investigators directly to a 17-year-old boy who lived less than a mile from Jessica's house, a boy who had been watching her, a boy who had been waiting, a boy whose face was so unexpected that when his identity was revealed, an entire community would be forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't always look like we expect it to. If this investigation is gripping you the way it's gripping me, I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel, because we're about to reveal who killed Jessica Ridgeway, how he was caught, and why his confession shocked even the FBI agents who had seen everything. But here's the question I want you to think about. If someone in your neighborhood was capable of this, would you know? Would there be signs? Would you notice? Or would they hide in plain sight, looking like everyone else, until the moment they decided to act? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and stay with me, because Act 3 is where everything comes together, where justice finally arrives, and where we learn that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones we never see coming. Here's the equation that would solve Jessica Ridgway's murder. 1 attempted abduction, plus 1 piece of discarded evidence, plus DNA from a water bottle, equals a 17-year-old killer who lived 6 houses away from Jessica's home. But before we get to how that equation came together, before we reveal the face behind the monster, we need to understand what that attempted abduction on October 19th really meant. Because it wasn't just another crime. It was a confession, written in action. It was a killer who couldn't stop himself from hunting again. The woman jogging in Kettner Lake open space that morning had no idea she was about to come face to face with Jessica Ridgway's murderer. She was just running her usual route, enjoying the cool October air, probably thinking about work or errands or any of the 1,000 mundane things we think about when we're doing something routine, and then someone approached her. Someone who didn't belong. Someone whose body language immediately triggered every instinct that tells you something is wrong. He tried to grab her, tried to force her toward a vehicle, but this victim fought back with everything she had. She screamed, she struggled, she broke free, and she ran, not stopping until she reached safety and called police. When investigators responded, they found something at the scene, something the attacker had dropped in the struggle. I'm not going to tell you what it was yet, because understanding how that piece of evidence connected to Jessica's case is part of the equation. But what I will tell you is this: it contained DNA, and that DNA would match DNA found on Jessica's water bottle, the one recovered from her backpack in Superior. Suddenly, investigators had a direct link between Jessica's murder and this attempted abduction, which meant the person who killed Jessica was still out there, still hunting, still dangerous. And that realization sent a wave of urgency through the investigation, because if he'd tried once since Jessica, he would try again. The description the jogger provided was detailed. White male, younger, possibly late teens or early 20s, average height and build, dark clothing, and most importantly, she'd seen his face. She could identify him. Police worked with her to create a composite sketch, and that sketch was distributed to every officer working the case. But investigators were also working another angle: the DNA evidence. The piece left at the attempted abduction scene was being fast-tracked through analysis, and the DNA from Jessica's water bottle, which had been processing since the backpack was found, was yielding results. DNA analysis isn't like what you see on television where results come back in hours. Real forensic DNA analysis takes days, sometimes weeks. But when you have an active predator, when you know someone is still out there hunting, labs prioritize. They work around the clock. They understand that every hour of delay is another opportunity for the killer to strike again. On October 20th, the day after the attempted abduction, investigators got their first major break. The DNA from the water bottle came back with a profile, a complete genetic fingerprint of the person who had last handled it. That profile was run through CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders and crime scenes. No match, which meant the killer had never been convicted of a crime serious enough to require DNA collection, which meant he had no significant criminal history, which meant he'd either been extraordinarily careful up until now, or Jessica was his first victim. But investigators had another option. Colorado had recently begun using familial DNA searching, a technique where, if you don't get an exact match in the database, you search for partial matches that might indicate a family member, parents, siblings, close relatives who might be in the system even if the suspect isn't. The familial search came back with a hit. Not an exact match, but close enough to indicate a biological relationship. The DNA in the system belonged to someone who shared significant genetic markers with the person who had touched Jessica's water bottle. Investigators now had a family, and from that family they could identify potential suspects, male relatives of the right age who lived in the geographic area where the crimes occurred. The list was short, very short, and one name on that list lived in Westminster, less than a mile from Jessica's house. His name was Austin Sigg. He was 17 years old, and he lived with his mother just 6 houses down from where Jessica had been taken. 6 houses. Think about that. Jessica had walked past his house dozens of times. He'd seen her walking to school, seen her playing outside, seen her living her life, completely unaware that someone was watching her with intentions that no child should ever be subjected to. On October 23rd, investigators obtained a warrant to collect a DNA sample from Austin Sigg. They approached his home, explained the warrant, and requested a voluntary sample. Austin complied without resistance. A simple cheek swab, 30 seconds of collection, and then the waiting began. The DNA was rushed to the lab for comparison against the profile from Jessica's water bottle and the evidence from the attempted abduction. The analysis would take at least 24 hours, maybe longer. And during that time, investigators had to make a decision. Do they surveil Austin Sigg, watching his every move to ensure he doesn't flee or harm anyone else? Or do they wait for the DNA confirmation before taking action? They chose surveillance. Unmarked cars, rotating shifts, eyes on Austin Sigg every moment until the DNA results came back. But they didn't have to wait long. On the evening of October 23rd, something extraordinary happened. Something that almost never occurs in cases like this. Something that would eliminate the need for surveillance, for warrants, for the careful building of a prosecutable case. Austin Sigg's mother called police. She had found something in her son's room, something that horrified her, something that made her realize her 17-year-old son might be responsible for the crime that had devastated their community. And despite every maternal instinct to protect her child, despite the knowledge that this phone call would destroy her family, she made the call. "I think my son killed Jessica Ridgeway," she told the dispatcher. Within minutes, investigators were at the Sigg home. Austin's mother let them in. She showed them what she'd found. And then she did something that demonstrated remarkable courage. She brought them to her son's room where Austin was sitting, and she told him to tell the truth. Austin Sigg looked at the investigators, looked at his mother, and then, without being questioned, without being pressured, without even being read his Miranda rights yet, he said 5 words that would close the investigation and open a window into darkness that few people ever see. "I killed Jessica Ridgeway." Just like that. No denial, no lawyer, no attempt to minimize or explain or justify. Just a flat, emotionless confession from a 17-year-old boy who had abducted, murdered, and dismembered a 10-year-old girl. Investigators immediately read Austin his Miranda rights. They asked if he understood. He said yes. They asked if he was willing to talk to them. He said yes. And then Austin Sigg proceeded to give one of the most detailed, disturbing confessions that investigators had ever heard. He told them he'd been watching Jessica for weeks. He'd seen her walking to school. He'd studied her routine. He knew she walked alone sometimes. He knew the route she took. He'd been planning it, thinking about it, fantasizing about it. On the morning of October 5th, he'd driven around the neighborhood waiting for an opportunity. When he saw Jessica walking alone, he pulled up beside her. He told her he'd give her a ride to school. And Jessica, who had been taught not to talk to strangers but who also lived in a safe neighborhood where people were generally kind, hesitated. That hesitation was all Austin needed. He grabbed her, pulled her into his vehicle, and drove away. The entire abduction took less than 30 seconds. No witnesses, no screams, no struggle that anyone saw. Just a predator who had been waiting and a child who had been in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Austin told investigators where he'd taken Jessica, his family's home. While his mother was at work, he'd brought Jessica into the house, into the basement. And there, in that basement less than a mile from where Jessica's mother was sleeping, believing her daughter was safely at school, Austin Sigg murdered her. I'm not going to describe the details of what he did. Jessica deserves dignity. Her family deserves to not have those details repeated endlessly. But what I will tell you is that Austin's confession revealed a level of premeditation and depravity that shocked even FBI agents who had worked hundreds of violent crimes. After killing Jessica, Austin dismembered her body. He placed her remains in garbage bags, and over the next several days, he disposed of those remains in different locations. Patridge Park in Arvada, other locations that he led investigators to after his confession. He kept some items as trophies. He discarded others, like the backpack, in places where they might be found or might not. And then, less than 2 weeks after murdering Jessica, Austin Sigg went hunting again, the jogger in Kettner Lake. He approached her with the same confidence, the same predatory calculation, but this time, his victim fought back. This time, he failed. And that failure led directly to his capture. The DNA results came back the day after Austin's confession. Perfect match. The DNA on Jessica's water bottle matched Austin's cig. The DNA from the evidence at the attempted abduction matched Austin's cig. The physical evidence confirmed what his confession had already revealed. Austin's cig was charged with multiple counts, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. Because he was 17 at the time of the crime, there were legal questions about whether he would be charged as a juvenile or an adult. The district attorney's office made the decision quickly. Given the nature of the crime, the premeditation, and the brutality, Austin Cig would be charged as an adult. He faced the possibility of life in prison without parole. On November 6, 2013, more than a year after Jessica's murder, Austin Cig appeared in court for his trial. But there would be no trial. Austin's attorneys had negotiated a plea agreement. In exchange for pleading guilty to all charges and sparing Jessica's family the trauma of a trial, the death penalty would be taken off the table. Austin Cig stood before the judge and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, second-degree kidnapping, and sexual assault on a child. He showed no emotion, no remorse, no indication that he understood the magnitude of what he'd done. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 78 years on the other charges. Austin Cig, who was 18 years old at sentencing, would spend the rest of his life behind bars. He would never walk free. He would never have the opportunity to hurt another child. Jessica's mother attended the sentencing. She read a victim impact statement that brought everyone in the courtroom to tears. "You took my baby," she said, looking directly at Austin Cig. "You took her future. You took her dreams. You took everything she was and everything she would have become. And for what? For your own sick gratification? I hope you spend every day of your life thinking about what you did. I hope Jessica's face haunts you forever." Austin Cig stared straight ahead. He didn't respond. He didn't apologize. He simply stood there, emotionless, as he was led away to begin his life sentence. The community of Westminster held a final memorial for Jessica. Thousands attended. They wore purple. They released purple balloons. They planted a purple garden in her memory at Chelsea Park, the park she used to walk past on her way to school. The garden still exists today. Every October, people leave purple flowers there. Purple ribbons still appear on trees throughout the neighborhood. Jessica's case led to significant changes in how Colorado handles missing children cases. Response times were improved. Amber Alert criteria were refined. Schools implemented new safety protocols. Parents became more vigilant. The balance between giving children independence and protecting them shifted, perhaps permanently. But here's what haunts me about this case, and I want you to really think about this. Austin Cig wasn't a stranger who drove into Westminster from another state. He wasn't some drifter passing through. He lived 6 houses away from Jessica. 6 houses. He was part of the community. His mother was a neighbor. He'd probably been seen around the neighborhood hundreds of times, and nobody suspected. Nobody knew. Nobody saw the darkness hiding behind a 17-year-old face. What does that tell us? It tells us that predators don't always look like monsters. They look like everyone else. They live among us. They shop at the same stores, walk the same streets, exist in the same spaces. And the only thing that separates them from everyone else is what they're thinking, what they're planning, what they're waiting for. Austin Cig's mother did something extraordinarily difficult. When she found evidence that her son might be involved in Jessica's murder, she called police. She chose justice over maternal protection. She chose the truth over her family's reputation. That took courage that most people will never have to summon. And while it didn't bring Jessica back, it ensured that Austin Cig would never hurt another child. The question that investigators asked themselves after Austin's confession was this: was Jessica his first victim? Austin claimed she was. He said he'd fantasized about it for years, but had never acted on it until October 5, 2012. Investigators weren't entirely convinced. The level of planning, the confidence, the way he executed the abduction without witnesses, all of it suggested someone who had practice. But no other cases were ever definitively linked to Austin Cig. If there were other victims, they remain unknown. What we do know is this: after Jessica, Austin tried again just 2 weeks later, which means if that jogger hadn't fought back, if she hadn't escaped, there would have been another victim, and another after that, because predators like Austin Sigg don't stop. They escalate, they refine their methods, they become more confident, more brazen, more dangerous. Jessica's case also revealed something about community response that gives me hope even in the darkness of this story. Over 1,000 volunteers searched for Jessica. Strangers who had never met her spent days walking through fields and forests, hoping to bring her home. They wore purple, they tied ribbons. They refused to give up, even when the statistics said hope was gone. That's humanity at its best. That's what communities can do when they come together. And while they couldn't save Jessica, their efforts ensured that her case remained in the spotlight, that investigators had the resources they needed, that tips kept coming in. That collective effort contributed to Austin Sigg's capture. Today, Jessica would have been 23 years old. She would have graduated high school, maybe gone to college, maybe become that kind cheerleader she dreamed of being, maybe changed the world in ways we'll never know because her life was stolen before she had the chance. Her mother still lives in Colorado. She's become an advocate for missing children, working with organizations that help families navigate the nightmare of having a child disappear. She speaks at schools about safety. She keeps Jessica's memory alive, not through the horror of how she died, but through the beauty of how she lived. Every October 5th, the community of Westminster remembers. They gather at Chelsea Park. They wear purple. They tell stories about Jessica. They remind themselves and their children that evil exists, but so does goodness. So does community. So does love that persists even after loss. The Purple Garden at Chelsea Park has a plaque. It reads, "In memory of Jessica Ridgeway. May her kindness inspire us all." Because that's what Jessica wanted to be remembered for. Not as a victim, not as a tragedy, but as someone who was kind, someone who made the world better simply by being in it. Austin Sigg sits in a Colorado prison. He's now 30 years old. He'll be there for the rest of his life. He's given interviews over the years, trying to explain why he did what he did, trying to make people understand his mindset. But there is no explanation that makes sense. There is no justification. There is only the reality that some people are broken in ways that can't be fixed, and the only thing society can do is remove them so they can't hurt anyone else. Here's what I want you to take away from Jessica's story. Not the horror, not the fear, but the lessons. First, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Teach your children to trust their instincts too. Jessica hesitated when Austin approached her. That hesitation shows she sensed something was off, but she was a polite child in a safe neighborhood, and politeness overrode instinct. Teach your children that it's okay to be rude, it's okay to run, it's okay to scream. Safety matters more than manners. Second, know your neighbors, not in a paranoid, suspicious way, but in a connected, aware way. Communities where people know each other, where people pay attention, are communities where predators have a harder time operating. Third, balance independence with protection. Jessica's independence wasn't wrong. Her mother's trust wasn't wrong. But the world is dangerous in ways we don't want to acknowledge. Find the balance. Give children the freedom to grow while maintaining the awareness to keep them safe. And finally, remember the victims as people, not just as tragedies. Jessica was a little girl who loved purple, who wanted to be kind, who set her own alarm clock because she was responsible. That's who she was. That's how she should be remembered. Now I need something from you. I need you to do more than just watch this video and move on. I need you to engage. Here's what I want you to do right now. First, leave a comment telling me what Jessica's story means to you. How has it changed the way you think about safety, about community, about the balance between independence and protection? I read every single comment, and your perspectives matter. Second, share this video. Not because I want views, but because Jessica's story needs to be told. Parents need to hear it. Communities need to remember it. The lessons from this case could save lives. Third, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We tell these stories because they matter, because victims deserve to be remembered, because understanding how these crimes happen is the first step in preventing them. And finally, I want you to do something in your own community. Wear purple on October 5th. Tie a purple ribbon somewhere visible. Tell someone about Jessica. Keep her memory alive, because that's how we honor victims, not by forgetting, not by moving on, but by remembering and learning and doing better. Jessica Ridgeway was 10 years old. She had blonde hair and blue eyes and purple glasses. She loved to dance. She wanted to be a kind cheerleader. She set her own alarm clock because she was responsible. She walked out her front door on October 5th, 2012, and she never came home. But her story didn't end that day. It continues every time someone remembers her. Every time a parent has a conversation with their child about safety. Every time a community comes together to search for a missing child. Every time someone chooses kindness, because that's what Jessica would have wanted. This is Easy Case. I'm your host, and I'll see you in the next investigation. Stay safe, stay aware, and remember, the best way to honor victims is to learn from their stories. Now go leave that comment. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me what Jessica's story means to you. And let's keep this conversation going, because that's how we make sure these stories matter.